Good afternoon. My today's guest is Dr. Evelyn Siegfried, curator of the Indigenous section of Royal Saskatchewan Museum. Doctor, good afternoon. How are you?
Good afternoon. I'm fine, thank you.
Thank you for accepting my invitation. I know you're in vacations, but you're busy, even though you are in vacation. According to our format, first I introduce my guests, and I will provide whatever information I found on the internet, and then you can correct me. I have to share my screen now. I think I will do that. And see.
Oh no, that picture, eek.
Yeah. Okay, that's what I found. Dr. Evelyn Siegfried is a curator of Indigenous Studies at Royal Saskatchewan Museum. And she's also adjunct professor of Department of Archeology and Anthropology at University of Saskatchewan. Evelyn's great-grandfather lived all his life in the boreal forests of northern Alberta and had a tremendous traditional knowledge base. He was a practical man who could make and build anything he needed from resources in the landscapes he moved through. And Evelyn's research interests were inspired by her grandfather, as she learned multiple uses for numerous species of plants found in the boreal forest. That interest in ethnobotany was also taken her to the plains regions of Canada, where plants were also an important part of traditional Aboriginal lifeways during the past. As an archaeologist, Dr. Siegfried has been inspired by her ethnobotanical studies to think about how people lived through time and their activities within the changing landscapes of central and north central Canada. Dr. Siegfried is currently working in two areas of Saskatchewan, the Stanley Mission Holy Trinity Anglican Church site in north central Saskatchewan, and surveying land southeast of the town of Banffy in the southern part of the province. Presently, Dr. Siegfried participates in the research project, the studies of physical parameters of Indigenous artifacts, collecting and preserving relating oral stories supported by Heritage Canada within the Museum Assistant Program. So, Evelyn, that's again what I found, a little information. And I've stolen some pictures from your Facebook. I'm not making secrets. So, yeah. Again, thank you very much for finding time. I have lots of questions to ask. As I told you that one of the purposes of this channel that I invite people that I want to ask them to teach me, to give me some knowledge. But I met you when we started our project about Indigenous artifacts, and since that. Many times I brought my students to Royal Saskatchewan Museums, and you kindly agreed to show us that Indigenous section. I don't know, maybe our official name is not Indigenous, maybe Aboriginal section, but I really love that, and I have very good feedback from my students. They all were very excited. I would like to start with that section. When it was created, I mean, whose idea was this? Are you the first curator of that section, or it was started before you?
It started before me. The Royal Saskatchewan Museum, as it's called today, has actually a fair history in the province. It was originally started in 1906, and it began, though it has always been a museum of natural history, it began with the collection of what is known as the Beaver Hills petroglyph, which is a very large stone that weighs close to 400 pounds or 80 some kilograms. It's a heavy, or more, 181 kilograms. Some, I can't remember anymore. But it's in poundage, it's around 400 pounds, and it had a face carved onto it. Eyes, a nose, mouth, and hair. Very interesting and stylized etching into the stone. The eyes very stylized. They're round, like a donut. So round with a rim, and then a punctated or a carved out hollow for the eye part itself. And the mouth the same way, lengthy with a ridge, but and then carved out. So very interesting, and it was sitting out in the landscape north of the Qu'Appelle Valley, and people would visit it. At the time, there were homesteaders who were out on the prairie, and they knew of its existence, and it was on a low hill, and they visited it and had their picnics there, local folks. And there was a gentleman who became worried that it might be stolen. So he contacted the government, which had just formed 1905. We had the Saskatchewan government come into existence. And he ended up contacting somebody in dealing with agriculture. And the person said, okay, collect the stone, pack it up, put it in a box, put it on the train, send it to Regina. And that's what he did. And once it came to I guess it would be the Department of Agriculture, the people who were running the business of agriculture for the government, they kept it. And then the idea went around, well, maybe we should have a museum. And so that's when the whole idea of the Saskatchewan Museum of Natural History was born. And from there, things developed on. People began to bring fossils, and people began to bring other things to this natural history museum. And part of that included a lot of Indigenous material. And so people brought moccasins and made donations of various things. And then in 1914, there was an important donation, purchase donation from a family, the Stanley family. And that was the first sort of major purchase by the museum of Indigenous materials. So lots of moccasins and beadwork, belts, different kinds of things that had been made by people from different communities that the Stanley family had collected over the years, and then they realized that they couldn't keep it anymore, so they wanted to sell it, and the museum bought it, and that really began, I think, the idea of collecting ethnographic materials from the Indigenous community within the newly developed province. And when from there, things just grew over the decades. And an ethnographic collection was really one of the first parts of the Indigenous, what I call the Indigenous Studies program now, that began with the museum. So of course they began to collect other things, fossils, and then things related to life sciences. So there's three parts. There's the three parts of the museum, and Indigenous studies being one of the important parts. And then as the years progressed, archaeology wasn't really part of this in the beginning. In the beginning, there was archaeology done. People were pot hunting, let's call it what it was at the time. People were finding artifacts out when they were plowing their fields, and people began to recognize that there were sites, places where there were a lot of artifacts actually coming out of the ground. So people began to dig at various places and collect the artifacts that they found. But the first real archaeological, what we would call a scientific archaeological excavation, didn't happen until 1955. And it was with the Mortlach site. And Boyd Wetlaufer was a known archaeologist who was hired by the government to go out and excavate the Mortlach site and then produce a report. So that was the first official report of archaeological activities. And then after that, he did the Long Creek site and produced a report by 1960. And it's after that that the archaeology kind of takes off. They hired a Dr. Thomas Kehoe and his wife, who were both qualified archaeologists, to work for the museum, SNMH at the time, and they were professional archaeologists, and they did a lot of interesting work, dug different sites, went to different places, and archaeology began to grow as part of the program of at the time when I first joined, it was called the Aboriginal History Unit. I'm the one who changed the name. And I called it the Aboriginal Studies Unit for a long time. And then now with the change of language, I think I prefer the Indigenous Studies program with it. And so we cover now two aspects. We have a large enough, a substantial enough ethnographic collection, which is all the beadwork and the beautiful things that have been made through and collected and donated and purchased through time from different communities. And then we have the archaeology materials. In 1980, the Historic Resources, or the Heritage Property Act, rather, Heritage Property Act was passed, and from there, there began legislation, and everything archaeological related was legislated, and so there were rules to follow, and a consulting community grew out of that, and everybody since then has had to follow the rules. And the Royal Saskatchewan Museum became the repository for all the materials that were excavated from sites within the province, within the provincial boundaries. And so it's very strict in that it is inclusive only of the provincial boundary, everything within the province. And the same goes actually for the ethnographic collection. Initially, it was quite big. They collected a lot of homestead artifacts and other things. People brought in their cool stuff and donated it to the museum, and the museum would take it. And then I believe it was in the 80s, they refined that a little more and said, and made the mandate more specific for the ethnographic collection, and that is restricting it to Indigenous materials from communities within Saskatchewan. So if somebody comes to me with a beautiful Cree jacket that's been made in Alberta or Manitoba, it doesn't fit. And I will not take it. I will redirect the person to the Royal Alberta Museum or the Manitoba Museum It cannot come to our museum. So, and which is good because it gives us a strict code of what we can accept. And so it's, in a lot of cases, it makes it easy to make a decision as to whether or not you can take a donation. In the case of archaeology, we will accept everything that is cultural from the province that is archaeological in origins. There's no, we won't accept materials from other provinces in that regard either. So
Yeah, you know, and one of my students, after visited your section, and after you talked them about your the artifacts, and she told me that, you know, Evelyn talks about things like these are something normally people talk about things if that is relates to their loved ones, like families. It's some there are some time memories of, relating to those things very warmly, and I noticed that too. So it's kind of like, for me, interesting. It's maybe it's for any museum working person. Do you have some, let's say, your favorite artifacts that's kind of like you feel closer to that? I don't know. It's maybe not very scientific question, but that was an observation of my students and myself too. And I've noticed that really you talk about your artifact with some kind of like very warmly, not just you know, as like a scientist, a little bit more than that.
they're not just things. I feel very tied to the collection. Because I am of an Indigenous background myself. I mean, I know that I'm not looking very Indigenous, but I am half Cree by birth, and I am Treaty. I'm a member of the Big Stone Cree Nation of Alberta. Band 458 is my band, and so I feel very tied to connected to the collection. I'm the first Indigenous person to really be a curator of these collections, which I think is important. I think it's important to have someone of an Indigenous background. I know I'm from Alberta, but I still, you know, in the past, the Cree were nomadic, so they were everywhere.
Yeah.
So boundaries, you know, the provincial boundaries are not, you know, not meaningful in the past at all, right? So so I feel a connection to the materials because that's something that I was always trying to connect to my background, my ancestral background. And so I find it really special that I am able to look after these, that I'm responsible. I'm a public servant, and these are public collections, and I feel very responsible for being like a steward. I'm a custodian, looking after them in the best way possible that we have, and making them available to everyone who wishes to come and visit the collections. We have some special things in the collection. A couple of the items, I guess, that are pretty cool, I think, for us. They're actually not, they don't belong to the museum. They're not items that have been accessioned. And one of them is the Pasqua pictograph, which of course is an Indigenous interpretation of Treaty 4 that is very unique. And sorry, we have some.
No, you know, that's maybe that's a sign. I'm sorry for interrupting you. That was my feeling that because I had noticed that your passion when you talked about that specific document, and I was thinking that if there is some favorite, maybe that would be that item. See, I had the right feeling.
It's a very it's a priceless piece. You know, I mean, it was purchased when it was put on. For it has an extremely interesting history. Um,
Yeah, could you
which
please tell that history? I mean,
um,
I know that many people, I didn't know about that the whole story. So if you could
ah
tell that, it would be very interesting.
oh, I'll try to make it a short. I could talk for a long time about it,
Yeah, maybe,
but
yeah,
I'll
but
try to
it's
make
really interesting story.
an abridged version of it. Um, of course, when Treaty 4 was signed in 1874, and there were promises that were made with the treaty for implements, farm implements, and so on. Besides, there were suits for the chiefs and the councillors. There was money. There was so basically a suite of promises were made to the people that had signed Treaty 4, all the communities that had signed Treaty 4. At the time in 1874, 13 chiefs were present at the first signing, and then of course there were adhesions to the treaty that happened later, and in the end there were uh, 21, 21 chiefs that received medals, and there are more bands than that now. I think it's 34. I might be have to be corrected on that. Right immediately after the treaty was signed, it appears there began to be problems, and the things that were promised weren't received and weren't being received. And by 1884 or 1883 rather, um, there people were talking. The communities were talking, obviously with each other, and I'm sure they must have been wondering what they could do, how they could get the attention of the government of somebody to address what was happening. So by complete happenstance, chance, there came a man from England, William Henry Barnaby, with his cousin, with his best friend and his brother-in-law, and they came to visit Canada to reconnoiter the business aspect of possibly going into farming. Maybe the idea of buying some land, investing in farming, doing something. And they traveled across the country by train and by cart and by wagon and so on. They went all the way to BC, and I think they were in like Oregon, Northern Oregon as well. And then they ended up going back to Winnipeg. They separated at one point with one of the gentlemen, Maisie Clive, who was the best friend. He went up into the Kamloops area, and there he caught typhoid. And he made his way back to Winnipeg and rejoined the party further down the road, like in Calgary, possibly outside of Calgary by train. And by that time, he was beginning to get very ill. They all made their way back to Winnipeg, and Maisie became sicker and sicker. Ended up in the hospital being looked after by a Dr. Kerr, um, and Maisie didn't make it, and he passed away somewhere around August the 8th or thereabouts, in the beginning of August in 1883. Now, in the interim between that happening and the separation, um, William Henry Barnaby went to the Bell Barn. He went on his way to Calgary. He went to Indian Head, stopped, did a tour of the Bell Barn, and then caught a buggy and went down to the Qu'Appelle Valley. And on the way into the valley, as they went down the hill, they could see, a number of teepees were set up in the valley, and they could tell something was going on. So they went, uh, they got themselves a hotel room or hotel rooms, and then they decided to go visit this teepee camp. And other people went with them who were around the hotel. So a group of people, and sure enough, there was a powwow going on, and there were 7 chiefs present, uh, of which one was Chief Pasqua. So they shook hands with the chiefs and did the powwow and enjoyed themselves, and had some tea and some stew and so on, and watched the dancing. And then after about 3 hours, they went back to their hotel and kept on, and then, carried on with their reconnoitering business. And about 3 days later, Barnaby was walking around in downtown Fort Qu'Appelle, and Chief Pasqua. This is of course his memory, his memoirs. So, is this really how this happened? We don't, I don't have the oral history of this, so it has to all be taken with a grain of salt. But this is what he said happened. He says Chief Pasqua walked up to him. He had this piece of paper. It was interesting. He could see that there were drawings on it, and the chief gave it to him, and he then had it in his possession, and that's what he ended up carrying it with him. So he had it in Winnipeg when he was there, with Maisie, and he wanted to, I guess he wanted to have somebody tell him, maybe explain what this ledger account was about, but he didn't. With everything that happened to Maisie, he was absolutely shattered, and he had to take his friend home back to England to be buried, which he did. But in when he was once he got back to England, he realized, well, maybe I could send this piece of paper back to Winnipeg to Dr. Kerr, and he will help me figure out what it is, which he did. Dr. Kerr, in turn, gave it to George Bryce, who was a minister there and a historian, and because Dr. Kerr was a doctor, he realized he really didn't know anything about it. Dr. Kerr, George Bryce was connected more to the community, and it's surmised that he gave it to an Indian agent at the time, which would have been Treaty 3 in Winnipeg, and that person, whoever had it, actually scribbled on it. So when you look closely at the pictograph, which is currently still up in the museum, you will see little writings in English. There are words where this person has written, fortunately in pencil, on the ledger, and above the pictures, because on the left side it looks like there's the meeting of representing the meeting of people for the treaty to make the treaty, and on the right side of the ledger it looks like the things that were promised with the treaty. That is for elders to interpret, not for me to interpret. But this is what it looks like, and everybody will see that when they look at it. Okay, it's knowing it's that history and how it ended up with Barnaby gives us a really good idea that it has to do with the treaty, and that the oral history that I've heard so far is that what Chief Pasqua wanted was that this ledger be taken to the Queen so that she could see what was promised and what was not happening, and so Barnaby, I guess, he didn't understand that, obviously, because he sent it to Bryce. Bryce wanted to keep it. He actually had a little museum in Winnipeg. He put it in there, and they had a hard time getting it back, but eventually it ended up back in England with Barnaby. He took it to London, put it in a very nice frame with glass, and hung it on the wall of his mansion in Bredenbury, Herefordshire, England, and there it stayed. Now we lose track of the Barnaby family at around the turn of the century. So all this happened before 1900, and then I've looked, and I'm not sure where the family went. So everything sort of disappears until 2000, when the Barnaby family put this document up for sale at auction, and it was purchased for a certain amount. there was an Alberta group that tried to purchase it, a group of chiefs, and they were unsuccessful in their bid to get it. And some anonymous person purchased it and then kept it until 2007 when they put it on the market again. And at that time, by that time, it was known that it was related to Chief Pasqua and so on. The story had been found, and people pretty well knew what it was. And so the Pasqua, there were people who got together. There was a group of people that put together a project to try to get this pictograph. And so they eventually a whole suite of money was put together. There was federal money, there was provincial money, there was United Church money, there was Pasqua First Nation money, there was donor money from donors, anonymous donors as well, and a pot was put together so that this could be purchased, and it was in Ontario for a while, but it ended up in New York, and that was not so great because when it went into New York, it could only be purchased. There was no way to claim cultural patrimony and have it just be given back to the Pasqua First Nation. So the money was spent, the pot was made, the money was spent, and it made its way back to Saskatchewan, and it is Pasqua First Nation cultural patrimony. Treaty 4, it applies to all the people of Treaty 4, and it's totally unique. It's basically, yes, money was paid for it, but I think it's priceless because of its history and and the origins of it.
Yeah.
And I at some point the elders of Treaty 4 will provide an interpretation of it that will tell its story better than my mumblings, and it will give the indigenous perspective, which is so important. We know we have this colonial side of the story, but what we are missing, and it's so important, is we're missing that indigenous side of the story.
Yeah, and it's very. I mean, it's the artifact document itself is very interesting, and the whole story relating that is also very. Sounds like a Hollywood movie kind of, but yeah, it's that story. I mean, I'm not kind of in that position to talk about the indigenous side, but just that's the post documents story itself. It sounds very interesting. Again, when I brought my students to your office, you talked about them about your student project. I believe your master project, and that was ethnobotanics.
Yeah.
What first came to my mind, that the first thing that I understood, that was those Venn diagrams you used for your project, because that was the mathematics relating stuff. So that's how I understood that. And it's, I mean, it's that was a master's student, but it sounds very interesting how you use that the data that you collected for making some conclusion regarding the languages and the people's migration or disposition. That was very interesting. Again, for my students, that was interesting too. Maybe if you could talk a little bit about that. When I introduce you, I used some of those pictures, and very nice pictures. In our format, I cannot show all of them, but it's really, really good pictures. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that project, that side of your research.
Well, one of the ways that I wanted to connect with my ancestry was, as I discovered with time, was through ethnobotany, through doing that as a master's project. My mother had always, my mother grew up in Wabasca, Demery, in the community, in the residential school there. And but before she went into the school as a little girl, she was in the bush with her grandmother and her sisters, and she accidentally got pushed into the fire by one of her sisters, fell into the fire, and was burned quite badly on her face, all around her neck, down to her chest and her shoulder. And of course, her grandmother was like, couldn't believe what had happened. And so she raced into the bush and she gathered plants and she made a poultice that she put on my mother's burn, I guess, and which was significant, and helped her. And so when my mother told us the story when we were children, we could look at her face and we could actually see the outline of a freckled area where skin damage had happened from this incident as a child. Now, once she went into the school, she did not acquire that knowledge from her grandmother, because the school, they were in the school for many years until she was 16, and did not, they spent some summers with their grandmother, but not as much time as maybe they could have. And so that knowledge was not passed down. And I discovered that in Northern Alberta, not very many communities had at that time, in the early 90s, dealt with that kind of knowledge and passed it on. So I thought this would be a good master's project. And the idea was archaeological in origin, that if we looked at how people used plants in the past, and how they used them, what they did with them, and how they disposed of all the parts of them, would we be able to see that in the archaeological record? And so that was the underlying reason of the approach, to go and look at what did people use in the boreal forest up in that area of the country. So I went with my mother, who speaks fluent Cree, as my translator. It was a totally cool project, and I networked with relatives. So I worked with her sister Eliza, who had stayed on the reserve, married and stayed on the reserve, and had acquired knowledge herself, and had relatives we had other relatives, cousins and so on, who were willing to talk to me about the use of plants in the past, what they remembered. And so we went and lived on the reserve in one of my auntie's houses, and went and talked with people, and talked about what was used as medicine. I had to be very, very careful about the medicine, because people, as I found out, if you learn about what's used as a medicine, and if you're too free with the information, people might think that they could use it and use it improperly, and really, you could really hurt yourself. You have to know what you're doing. This knowledge is normally, medicine knowledge is passed down in a very prescribed way. If you're going to go down that path to be a healer, you have to do it right. You have to ask the right questions. You have to go to the right person. You have to do it in the traditional way. And what I was doing was asking about the use of the plants, but I didn't want to know how to use the plant. I didn't want to know how to mix it with anything else. So just that you collected the plant. Did you use the flower? Did you use the stem? Did you use the root? What part did you use? What did you do with the parts that you didn't use, and so on. So that was the kind of information I was collecting, and was very careful in my write-up, in my master's thesis, to make sure that people couldn't cook things, cook things up themselves. But there's also the aspect of there's lots of food plants, there are lots of berry plants, and it was surprising how many berries there are in the bush that are tasty and good to eat, and then other plants that were used to make things, craft plants, like spruce roots and birch bark and so on, and how they were used and how people made things with them. And then as well, there were charms, things that were used as a charm. That was very interesting, and so on. So the multiple uses of the plants that people remembered uh, from the past, and people were still using quite a number of plants at the time that I was asking. That was in the early 90s, and so there were people that went out and collected. I also had a cookum. It was my grandfather's sister who had become a medicine person, and she helped me by telling me about the different plants that she knew of that were used, and then I helped her by going and collecting plants for her in the bush for her to use. Of course, if so, I learned from that. I had to be very careful in how I collected anything for her, because the plants, as it was described to me, everything is medicine, and medicine is like, it's a different meaning. It's not medicine in the medical sense of how we think of medicine. It's more like power. Um, so the world is medicine. The sky, the land, the rocks on the land, and the plants. The plants had power. So if you collected a plant, it's kind of like a yin yang idea. If that a plant has both good and bad possibilities. If you don't collect it right, you can trigger the bad possibilities of the plant. If you collect it properly, you will trigger the good possibilities of the plant. So in order to do that, you have to go with the right heart, with the right intention, with tobacco, and go into the bush and place your tobacco, say your prayers, ask the creator for that your permission to use this. I'm going to collect this plant. I want to collect this plant, but I'm doing it with a good heart, and I'm doing it with good intentions. It will be used for good, because there was bad medicine, as I found out. and what I was told was, if you do it wrong and you do bad medicine, you cannot come back from that. It's like going to a dark place from which you can't come back. So I was warned, never go to the bad side of the medicine plants, right? So always be careful. So, I mean, so for me, not having been raised in a traditional lifestyle, living in small towns in Alberta all my life, and that's how I got my education, and then going to university. Going into the bush was so interesting for me, by myself, with my tobacco, surrounded by the beautiful greenery and nobody around me, and talking to the sky, right? And talking to what seemed to be myself, but of course I was talking to the world around me. And so learning that, internalizing that, was very different, and of course completely strange to me, from all the learning that I'd done in school, and a more scientific background, right? You had to just let go of all of that, and immerse yourself in what was asked of me, and that was to do it right? So that she could use those plants the way that they needed to be used, because she could no longer go do that kind of collection herself. She was at that age. So it was extremely interesting, and very interesting to write up as well, to be having to be very careful about the medicine aspect of it. There were people who weren't happy with what I was doing. Uh, they thought that I was going to steal knowledge and sell it maybe to pharmaceutical companies and make myself a millionaire, maybe in the process, or get some good money, which I never did.
Yeah.
It would be lovely to be rich. I am not. I am not certainly not that. I would never betray my own knowledge, right? My own culture that way.
Yeah.
If there was ever to be money made from that kind of knowledge, I would hope that it would go to the band, go to the people, right? That's the way it should be. There has been so much knowledge that has been stolen from Indigenous people, and I see that as wrong. And
Yeah.
so I could not do that,
Yeah.
not in good
That's true.
conscience.
That's true.
So it was a really, really interesting research project, and I learned a lot from that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's I've tried to learn too when I started this. We started together this Indigenous artifact project, and one more thing I've learned. Um, that I'm very far from archaeologists, but I like observing people's behavior. Um, and I'm kind of like lucky that I was able to a little bit at least to see the archaeological survey, how people do that. They explained me how to do that, but mostly I was just observing how they work. What I noticed, and you worked in the field a lot, so that's why I'm asking this question. Uh, Archaeologists, they are very different in the office and on the field. They change and they become very passionate. I mean, really, they become different people in good meaning of this word.
Mm-hmm.
I know that from your research experience, and I see you participated in many field works. Do you remember any maybe funny stories, some about your field work?
But yeah, I have a funny little story from Stanley Mission when I went up there when I first joined the Royal Saskatchewan Museum with Dr. Margaret Hanna, who was the curator at the time. She had a project that was going on up at Stanley and around the church in the meadow, and so we were doing some excavating. She discovered there was a cabin, or remnants of a cabin there, and so the idea was to dig up the cabin and see what it was like and do a report on it and so on. In the end, there was a student that Carmen Vanderswan who did her master's thesis on that site and what we excavated and so on. So we just had a lot of fun together, Margaret and myself and Carmen, and then we had people from the community. There was Kiefer Roberts and there were a couple of girls one summer. We all worked together in the meadow. So one day I was sitting in my unit and digging away, scratching at the dirt, and it was really hot, and the sun was shining, and all of a sudden something glinted in my unit, sparkled, didn't just glint. I could see this sparkle, and I was like, oh, I think I found it, diamonds. diamonds, diamonds. So I carefully brushed what I was finding. I was, kind of spouting diamonds, diamonds, and out of the clay pops this little piece of an old brooch, and I wished it was diamonds. It would have been that would have been very exciting. It turned out to be rhinestone, just crystal glass, right? But for a while, I was very excited, thinking I'd found a treasure, right, in the meadow. But
Yeah,
um,
that's it's
one of
yeah. Okay, yeah.
that's exciting. Now, one of the other things that I found that I discovered about, I went back, so I did that work with Margaret, and then I went back by myself in 2008 and did some reconnoitering field work around the meadow. We were going to look for the parsonage. We wanted to find out where was the parsonage relative to the church. Could we find any remnants of it? Where was the fence? Where was the where were the buildings and so on? So we went there and I did some shovel testing. And we dug up rusty cans, fish scales, rusty nails, bits of rubber boots, window glass. These are the exciting things that came out of the shovel test. I've been working on the report for that recently, and the can that I dug up turns out to have a very interesting label, crash imprinted into it, that it's the Governor and Company of Adventurers into the Hudson's Bay, which is the first group of people that came, that was formed, the Hudson's Bay Company that got Rupert's Land in 1670, granted to them. Well, that's another story. But that company was the first iteration of the Hudson's Bay Company. Now, I don't know. I'm very curious about this can now, because I don't know if others have been found with that crash imprinting on it. How old is it? Well, it has to be after 1670 because it's related to that company, the Company of Adventurers, and so that's something that I'm hoping to look into and see what it means. See where, if it's related to the early fur trade in that part of the country, because of course the Stanley Mission is on the Churchill River, and the Churchill River used to be called the English River because of the traders. It was the English traders that went up and down the Churchill River to do the fur trade, and so it was a lot of British traders and Orkney men and Irish, people from Ireland, people from the Orkneys, people from Britain, and so on, that went with Métis and Indigenous people to buy and sell furs, and send them back to England to make the hats that were so popular in England way back in the day, right? So it's an interesting connection, and an indication of possibly early travel on that river in that spot, right? Particularly, it's just because it's just a random. I mean, it's funny when you dig something up and you stand and you look around. I always, when I find things like arrowheads or anything, you stand and you look around and you think about who was the person that made this, who held this, how long ago, and what was going on back then. I mean, I always take a little trip down into the past when I find things and wonder, and it makes me think and wonder about old times, right? A different time frame.
Kind of time travel.
Yes.
Yeah.
If I could do the Great Karnak and put it to my head and get the story.
Yeah, it's maybe that is the kind of like make the archaeology and attractive for young people, for students. I would like to take an opportunity and list the names of students who worked with us within the project about Indigenous artifacts. That's some Indigenous students, Alice Custer, Anne-Marie Dorion, and Margaret Jobs, Scarlett Wool. But I was pleasantly surprised when the many non-Indigenous students, they showed the interest and they joined the team that was Josmani Mahanta. She's from University of Saskatchewan. Kai South family from and Mara Matheson from University of Regina. They are not Indigenous students, but they showed the interest. And Mara and the scholars, they worked with you mostly, and maybe because Mara mostly she worked at Royal Saskatchewan Museum with you, so maybe you could talk about that as you communicated with her more often. So what brought her to that project?
Well, Mara was in the history department at the University of Regina, and she became part of an internship program that was run through the Faculty of Arts, and Lynn Gidluck and Dr. Philip Charrier um, at, uh, at the U of R. And they she wanted to do something um, that was exhibit related, and it kind of it fell very well within what we were trying to do for the map project with the First Nations University. And so she came to me at the annex where I work, which is not the museum building, but at a different building. And we went through the artifacts one by one, so that she would know what she was looking at, what was interesting about the artifacts, what was important about them, and the meaning that I could see with them. So I was just passing on knowledge to her so that she could listen to the oral histories that the elders had passed on from the two communities of Sturgeon Lake and Pelican Narrows, and from that make the connection between oral history and community and these items that had an archaeological origin. So knowing that they were from the past at some time, and so I had chosen a site that had some stratigraphy that went through time, and that site had actually been dated back in the 80s when it had been dug, the Broken Axle site, and then the idea was that she would make an exhibit that would that really the idea was that this exhibit would go back to the community. That's the important part for me, is that elders have passed on their knowledge. Something has to go back to the community. We're sharing something. This came out of the ground, and this is very different from what elders know in terms of they haven't done archaeology, certainly not the way that it's done today, but they do have the knowledge of the past, and so we would be showing the community this and sharing. These are some of the items that have come out of the ground in this area of the country, and it goes back. So the dates go back from that site to close to 5,000 years in time. So very important to share. Unfortunately, COVID has interfered with that. We didn't really get to the exhibit portion of the project, but maybe we will be able to do that with another student. I hope possibly.
Yeah,
We'll
I
see.
hope we will do that.
Yeah.
I hope we will do that. Now, just I would like to spend the next maybe few minutes. I want to move to another side of Atlantic Ocean. Now, I will show one picture. I will share my screen again. I'm not making secret. I talked to you about that before.
Yes.
But it's interesting for me, and I think it could be interesting for more, not just for us.
Mm-hmm.
Um, some while ago, I found on the internet the picture uh, of the carpet. This is on the from the left side, my left side.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if my cursor can be seen. This is a carpet. It was made approximately 1890s uh, in Azerbaijan, in my native country, and in the region where I was born. It's called the Ganja Basaf, that area.
Mm.
I posted this picture on my Facebook, and I remember you told me that you saw something similar carpet. Um, from your, I think you said from your, yeah, I will ask you to talk about that. In your father's collection, or
Mm-hmm.
and you told me that your father was born in Königsberg. Uh, it used to be a German city, and that it now it belongs to Russia.
Yes.
So what I can see, again, I'm a mathematician, I see a lots of common geometrical elements used in these two carpets. But to be honest, first it kind of mm, why I noted this carpet, because um, I saw very similar carpet in my parents' house.
Mm.
My grandmother, she had made carpets and very similar to this one, and it also had like three sections like these, and very similar geometrical elements.
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly, I saw similar, again, the carpets with similar elements in many houses in neighborhood when I
Mm.
was a child. That time I didn't pay attention, but now I remember that. It looks like the people, and they were about the same age probably, because that was my grandmother and some relatives of my grandmother. It looks like they had kind of like template, that they use that template and they made
Yes.
these carpets.
A mental
But
template.
yeah, interesting thing that another interesting thing is that we had a German colony in our neighborhood. I'm just thinking again. I'm not an
Mm.
archaeologist. I have no idea about the carpets. Maybe that someone can make research about that. But how comes that these two carpets, one from Azerbaijan, another is formal in the past, a German city, they have some many common elements.
Yes.
Again, it's do you have an idea about that?
Well, yeah, when I saw your posting about your carpet, immediately my mind jumped and I went, "Oh, how interesting," because I have this piece at home that I've inherited from, and it is from my father's side of the family. He immigrated to Canada in 1951 from Germany after the war, after the Second World War, and their house had been totally bombed out in Königsberg. They lost everything, and I guess his parents went through the rubble of the house and collected a few things that had survived the bombing, and they brought them with them when they went to Rostock after the war because they had nothing left, and Königsberg was completely run over by the Russians, and became Kaliningrad. It became Russian territory eventually after the war, and so there was no going back really, and so they had these items, and then I guess his mother, my father's mother, had them. She lived in Berlin for a while until she died, and then his brothers collected her stuff and all the items that they had saved from the house. And in 1964, my father went to Germany to his brother in Worms and his other brother in Sweden, Stockholm, and visited them. And they together divided up the contents of the household that had been inherited. And my father took this that it looks like to me more like it could be a rug, but it also has little loops along one edge of it so that it can be hung on the wall. So like a wall hanging. And that was how we had it in the house when we lived in Calgary. Um, dad dad brought it he brought it back to Canada. We had it uh, in my early memories. We didn't put it up. I don't think we really had the wall space for it. But once we were in Calgary and we had our nice big house, that's when it got hung up on the wall in all its splendid glory. And when he talked about it, he himself did not really know the history of it. He, what he told us about the house in Königsberg was that it was a house filled with antiques, that his parents were interested in old things, antiques, and so on. And I also have a rug that is supposed to be an Inca rug, originating from Peru, right?
Mhm.
And and so on. So the various things, and so he only knew that this piece was his parents had collected it at some time
Mhm.
in their past, in their I don't really know.
Mhm.
I just
Mhm.
know that it doesn't fit anything. Every time I've looked at it, it's like not it's not from a culture that I'm
Mhm.
familiar with. I can
Mhm.
I can tell that.
Mhm.
So when I saw your rug, I went, oh, you know, it kind of,
Mhm.
I'm seeing similarities to
Mhm.
that part of the world. I think that the origins of this rug or wall hanging, whatever you want to call it, is from that part of the world. And that's all I know. I would
It's
love to know
yeah.
more.
Yeah, yeah, it's a globe is it looks like it's very small actually. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's and the zoom it makes it even smaller. So I'm really glad that we had you had time and for talking about very interesting things. I hope you will have more time to continue in future and to talk about many things. Thank you very much for your time. It was very interesting, as always, to talk to you, and I have no doubt it will be interesting for many more people. I always enjoy, but I decided to share it, at least a little piece of that, to share with other people too.
Mm,
Specifically with my students, I know that it will be very interesting for them. Thank
yeah.
you very much for your time.
Well,
Thank you.
thank you for having me. It's been wonderful. You've been a wonderful host, and
Thank
and
you.
uh, and it's been fantastic.
Thank you.